Rain lashed against the windows. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within the walls of the precinct. It was one of those nights where the city seemed to be crying, every drop of rain a tear shed for the lost souls. Inspector Davies, a man hardened by years on the force, stared at the file on his desk. The dim light cast shadows on his face, highlighting the lines etched by countless sleepless nights and relentless cases. He had seen it all, or so he thought. Another murder. Another life brutally cut short. The scene was all too familiar, yet each case carried its own unique weight, its own story of tragedy and loss. He sighed. This case felt different, heavier. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime, it was the layers of mystery that surrounded it. The more he delved into it, the more elusive the truth seemed. The victim, a renowned scientist, found lifeless in his lab. A man dedicated to uncovering the secrets of the universe now silenced forever. His work had touched many lives, and his death sent ripples through the scientific community. No forced entry, no witnesses, just a web of unanswered questions. The lab, usually a place of discovery and innovation, had become a scene of despair and confusion. The prime suspect, the victim's protege, a young man named Edward. A promising talent, now under the shadow of suspicion. His future, once bright, now seemed uncertain and bleak. Davies picked up the file, his eyes drawn to Edward's photo. The young man's face was a mix of innocence and anxiety, a stark contrast to the grim reality of the situation. A handsome young man, his face now etched with worry, his eyes filled with what looked like grief. Was it a mask? Or was he truly mourning the loss of his mentor? The lines between guilt and innocence blurred in Davies's mind. Davies was determined to find out. He had a duty to the victim, to the city, and to himself. The truth had to be uncovered, no matter where it led. He knew the drill. Interview the suspect, follow the evidence, let the truth reveal itself. But this time, the usual steps felt like walking through a fog, each clue more elusive than the last. But something about this case, something about Edward, tugged at Davies' gut. It was an instinct, a feeling that there was more beneath the surface, something that wasn't immediately visible. He couldn't shake off the feeling that there was more to it than met the eye. The answers were out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. And Davies was ready to face whatever truths lay ahead. Edward sat opposite Davies, his posture stiff, his face pale. The setting was serene, a stark contrast to the turmoil within Edward. The park was filled with the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves, but Edward seemed oblivious to it all. He answered questions with a stammer, his eyes darting around the room. It was clear that he was struggling to maintain his composure. His hands fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, a telltale sign of his anxiety. His nervousness was palpable, but Davies had seen enough to know that guilt and fear often wore the same mask. The seasoned investigator had encountered many like Edward, each with their own story, each with their own secrets. "Edward, tell me about your relationship with the professor," Davies asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Davies' voice was firm but laced with a hint of empathy. He knew that to get to the truth he needed Edward to feel safe, to feel understood. He had a way of getting people to open up, to let down their guard. It was a skill honed over years of practice, a blend of patience and persistence. Edward hesitated, then began to speak in a low voice, his words tumbling over each other. We were close. He was more than just a professor to me. He was a mentor, a guide. He spoke of their shared love for science, of the professor's guidance, of their disagreements, of the heated argument they had had just days before the murder. We argued about my thesis. He thought I was taking the wrong approach. I was so angry, I said things I didn't mean. Davies listened intently, every word, every inflection, every pause, searching for a crack in Edward's facade. He knew that the truth often lay in the details, in the moments of hesitation and the slips of the tongue. But Edward, despite his nervousness, stuck to his story. He recounted the events with a consistency that was either the mark of a truthful man or a well-rehearsed liar. A story that painted him as a devoted student, a grieving friend, and most importantly, an innocent man. Yet Davies couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Days turned into nights, and nights into days, as the investigation dragged on. Davies and his team worked tirelessly, piecing together the puzzle of the professor's murder. They combed through every detail, every shred of evidence, hoping to find the one clue that would break the case wide open. The evidence was like smoke, there but impossible to grasp. It seemed to slip through their fingers just when they thought they had a hold on it. Fingerprints at the crime scene pointed to Edward, but the murder weapon was missing. Without it, their case was incomplete, like a puzzle with a missing piece. Witnesses claimed to have seen Edward near the lab on the night of the murder, but their testimonies were shaky at best. Some were unsure of the time, others of the exact location. It was as if the night had played tricks on their memories. Each piece of evidence seemed to tighten the noose around Edward, yet Davies couldn't shake off the nagging feeling that something wasn't adding up. The pieces fit too neatly, too conveniently. Why would Edward, a man with a promising future, throw it all away? He had everything to lose and nothing to gain from such a heinous act. Why kill the man who had been his mentor, his guide? The professor had been more than just a teacher to Edward. He had been a father figure, a beacon of wisdom and support. The more Davies delved into the case, the more he felt like he was wandering in a labyrinth, each turn leading him not closer to the truth, but further into a maze of confusion. Every new piece of information seemed to contradict the last, creating a tangled web of uncertainty. Davies knew that to solve this puzzle, he would need to look beyond the obvious, to question everything he thought he knew. Only then could he hope to find the truth hidden within the shadows. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Dr. Evans, the medical examiner, called Davies, his voice grave. "Davies, you need to see this." Minutes later, Davies stood in the medical examiner's office, staring at the report in his hand. Edward was dying. A rare, aggressive illness was ravaging his body. He had weeks, maybe months left. Davies felt a cold dread grip his heart. It all clicked into place. Edward's nervousness, his desperation, his insistence on being at the lab that night. Davies reread the report, each word hammering the truth deeper. Edward wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He was a desperate man, clinging to his last days, trying to complete his mentor's work. But why? What was so important that it warranted risking everything? Davies knew he was just a heartbeat away from the truth. Section 5. The Detective's Dilemma. The weight of the revelation hung heavy on Davies's shoulders. He looked at Edward's file, now imbued with a tragic light. The young man wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a dying man clinging to a last shred of hope. Davies wrestled with his conscience. Could he expose Edward's secret, shatter the fragile facade he'd built around himself in his final days? But what about justice for the professor? The law was clear, but wasn't justice about more than just punishment? Wasn't it about understanding, about compassion? Davies knew what he had to do. He had a case to solve, but he also had a duty to see the human behind the crime. He would find the truth, but he would do it his way with empathy and understanding. The clock was ticking. Every second felt like sand slipping through Davies' fingers. He visited Edward, not as an investigator, but as a man offering a listening ear. He found Edward weaker, his skin pallid, his eyes losing their spark. Yet, he clung to his research, his desk overflowing with papers, his mind a whirlwind of equations and formulas. Edward, sensing a shift in Davies's demeanor, opened up. He spoke of the professor's groundbreaking research, a potential cure he had been developing, a cure that could save millions, a cure Edward was now racing against time to complete. He admitted to being at the lab that night, to arguing with the professor, but swore he hadn't killed him. He had found the professor dead. The fear of being implicated, of his life's work being left unfinished, had driven him to flee. Edward's confession, filled with raw emotion and desperation, resonated with Davies. He dug deeper, scrutinizing the professor's notes, his research, his collaborations. A pattern emerged, a hidden rivalry within the scientific community, a competitor threatened by the professor's breakthrough. Davies followed this new lead, his instincts sharpened by years of experience, his heart heavy with the knowledge of Edward's fate. The evidence fell into place. A jealous colleague, a sabotaged experiment, a desperate act to bury the competition. The professor hadn't been murdered. His death was an accident, a tragic consequence of his own groundbreaking work. The truth was bittersweet. It cleared Edward's name, but it couldn't erase the shadow of death that hung over them. The professor was gone, his life's work incomplete, his legacy hanging by a thread. Davies sat with Edward, explaining everything. He saw a wave of relief wash over the young man's face, followed by a deep, soul-wrenching sadness. He had been given a second chance, a chance to finish what he started, a chance to honor his mentor's legacy, but he knew his time was running out. The case stayed with Davies long after the dust settled. He watched Edward pour his remaining energy into his work, his brilliance shining even brighter in the face of his impending mortality. The world hailed Edward as a genius, celebrating his scientific breakthrough. But Davies knew the truth, the tragic truth that lurked beneath the surface of success. He had learned that justice wasn't always black and white. Sometimes it was about understanding, about compassion, about seeing the human behind the crime. And sometimes the greatest punishment was the burden of a secret, the weight of a truth too heavy to bear.